As most of you have probably seen or read by now, on the PTS for patch 1.8, the damage rolls for your weapons on the gloves will be changing from a flat weapon damage amount to a percentage-based value, which is bound to give the lower rate of fire weapons in the game at least a little bit of a bump up. I'm not saying that low RPM weapons are going to be the thing to go for now, but at least this will push them in the right direction towards usability compared to the high fire rate weapons. However, this change from flat weapon damage to percentage-based damage is so much more complicated than just that. It doesn't just make the lower RPM weapons stronger or the higher RPM weapons weaker, but it also changes the added damage that you get from these gloves from something that could be seen as multiplicative to something that is now additive. And it also acts as a multiplier on top of the firearms and the base damage now, which in the past it did not. This change, it also changes when people actually want to pick up this stat roll. It used to be best in slot no matter on what build, but that's going to change, because in some cases this stat roll is going to be very strong, and in other cases it's going to be very weak. So with this video, I want to take you through all of that. I want to take you through the changes and how to get the most out of this stat roll when patch 1.8 drops. So let's begin. We can start this whole video off very simple by just looking at what these percentage-based values mean for a high RPM weapon such as the Lightweight M4 or a low RPM weapon such as the Black Market AK-74. These are both assault rifles. For comparison, I'm going to take the highest possible damage rolls that you can get on both of them. I think that's fair because in 1.8 we have the optimization station anyway. And I'm also going to assume that the player that's carrying these weapons has 5,500 firearms, which is about the average that players have nowadays. On a gear score 256 Lightweight M4, which has a base damage of 10,404 and a firearm scaling of 1.3. And by the way, for those that don't know how firearm scaling on weapons work, this weapon has a 1.3 firearm scaling. So that means that for every point of firearms that we have, the base damage of this weapon is going to be increased by 1.3. So we have the 1.3 times 5,500 here, and we add that to the base damage of the weapon, which was 10,404. In that situation, we end up with a gun that hits for 17,554. So, what do we do with this? Well, in patch 1.7, we of course have the flat weapon damage on the gloves, which at its maximum roll is 1,334. If we would add this to the base damage of our assault rifle, it would amount to about a per bullet damage increase of 7.5%. So the damage roll on the gloves gave us 7.5% extra damage. Doing the same thing for the Black Market AK-74, that is going to give us a different result though. It's not going to increase our damage by that 7.5%. Just take a look at this. The AK-74 has a base damage of 12,805 per bullet and a firearm scaling of 1.6. It's obvious that the AK has a higher base damage and a higher firearm scaling than the M4 because it also has a lower RPM, so the developers kind of tweaked these numbers to make up for each other. But if we put these values into the formula, you can see that we're ending up with a gun that hits for 21,605 damage per bullet. In this case, if we add that same 1,334 damage that we get from the gloves, it only amounts to about a damage increase of 6.2%, which is less than that we had with the M4. And this is actually one of the bigger reasons why high RPM weapons would be preferred up until now, because the flat weapon damage that you get from the gloves did a lot more for those high RPM weapons due to their base damage being lower and their RPM being higher. In patch 1.8, this is going to change. Assault rifle damage on the gloves is changing to a percentage-based number, 6% to be precise. So no matter if you're running with the M4 or the AK, this stat roll will always increase your DPS by the same amount. It's always going to be 6%, so it's going to be just as good no matter what weapon you pick it for. And at a quick glance, you would say, well, that's cool. That's it. You know, low RPM weapons are relatively better now. High RPM weapons are relatively a little bit worse, but it's a good change overall. We're done here. Case closed. But if you were to say that, you know, you'd be wrong, because this change does more than just that. It's also going to make high firearms builds hit a lot harder, and on the contrary, low firearms builds are going to be hitting less hard. Alright, so let me explain what's going on here. Let's get back to our example of the AK-74, but instead of comparing it to the Lightweight M4, we're going to compare two AK-74s to each other. The only difference between these AKs is that one has 3,000 firearms to go with it, and the other one has 10,000 firearms to go with it. I know, it's quite the extreme difference. Not a lot of people are going to be running around with 10,000 firearms, but this is going to be an easy example to show you guys what I'm talking about. First up, in patch 1.7, with 3,000 firearms, the AK ends up with a base damage of 17,605. And with 10,000 firearms, the AK ends up with a base damage of 28,805. So when we then add that 1,334 assault rifle damage to both of these, you will see that this extra damage will have a much bigger effect on the player with low firearms, as it increases his damage by 7.5%, as opposed to the 4.6% that it increases for the high firearms player. That is also why, in patch 1.7 and before, even on my healer builds, I would always pick the flat weapon damage as a stat roll on my gloves, even if I had almost no firearms at all. You can see here that they would still give me a good amount of damage relatively. But again, in patch 1.8, both the damage of the low firearms player and the damage of the high firearms player will be increased by that 6%, which means that the hard hitters are going to hit even harder, and vice versa as well. What this means for the game is that with all the damage-oriented builds, getting these damage rolls on the gloves is going to be quite essential now, even more important than before. However, on low firearms builds, for example with the healer builds in PvE, you'd actually be better off speccing into, for example, skill haste, enemy armor damage, and critical hit damage, given that you have a strong pulse to provide you with a crit chance, because 6% of a very low amount of base damage isn't going to give you a lot of extra damage. So that's another thing you're gonna have to keep in mind going into patch 1.8, but that still isn't the whole picture, because there's one more thing you need to know about these percentage-based damage rolls on the gloves that the game doesn't really tell you, and that is that these buffs are additive with other damage bonuses, while in patch 1.7, with the flat weapon damage bonuses, you could say that they were multiplicative. So that is, of course, also going to change a whole lot of things. Saying that the flat weapon damage on the gloves is multiplicative isn't 100% true though. How it actually works is, as you've just seen, you add the flat weapon damage to the base damage, and then from that point on, that amount of damage gets multiplied by any buffs the player might have. So in patch 1.7, the 15% damage increase from a booster shot, in fact, would also apply to the flat damage values on the gloves. But in patch 1.8, again, that's gonna change. These percentage-based values on the gloves, they will be a part of the bonuses stacked on top of the base damage, and thus they're going to be additive with the other damage bonuses. The 15% damage from the booster shot will not have an effect on the 6% assault rifle damage. That's a whole lot of numbers, that's a whole lot of talk, but basically what this means in-game in real situations is that players that have a lot of damage bonuses activated at the same time, for example skill gloves, booster shot, competent, all those bonuses, those players that rely on those type of bonuses, they're going to be hitting less hard in patch 1.8. Let's grab another example here. We're gonna go back to 5,500 firearms for now, and we're going to pick up the AK-74 again. In patch 1.7, this weapon would deal 22,939 damage per bullet. And in patch 1.8, with the same build under the same circumstances, it would deal 22,901 damage per bullet. The only difference is that in patch 1.7 we're using the flat weapon damage bonus, and in patch 1.8 we're using the percentage-based bonus. But now, this is where we gotta pay attention, because in both cases we're going to be adding some player buffs on top of this. Let's take the 16% from the skill gloves, the 15% from the booster shot, the 10% from competent, and then let's say another 10% from fire bullets. All of these bonuses are additive with each other, but multiply off of the base damage. So, in patch 1.7, we can just add them all up together and then increase the base damage by 41%, giving us 32,334 damage per bullet. However, in patch 1.8, the 6% assault rifle damage is going to be calculated additive with the other bonuses. And that means that we're only gonna deal 31,759 damage per bullet, which is, it's quite a bit less. And of course, if we look at these differences from an isolated point of view, as that we are right now, sure, you won't think too much of them. You know, the difference is not that big, it's not that significant. But when you take the worst versus the best case scenarios of each of these, you put those all together and you're definitely going to see a more noticeable result. The difference on assault rifles is not going to be that big, but I can still come up with an example that will make you see the big difference. For example, in patch 1.7, we have an urban MDR, 10,000 firearms, and with the assault rifle damage rolls on the gloves. This thing is going to hit for 60,745 per bullet, but in patch 1.8, under the exact same conditions, with the exact same build, this weapon is suddenly going to hit for 62,976 damage. Still not convinced? Alright, let's take a look at this healer build with 3000 firearms with the lightweight M4 that uses a booster and competent to get most of his damage. In patch 1.7, that per bullet damage was going to sit around 19,548. But in patch 1.8, with the exact same build under the exact same circumstances, this guy is suddenly going to hit for only 18,738 damage per bullet. And then, again, we've only been talking about the assault rifles, where it doesn't really show as much. So going to the other weapon classes, there's some stuff going on with those as well. Just as with the assault rifles, the shotguns and the LMGs are also going to have that 6% damage increase on the gloves, and then for some reason the SMG damage rolls, they only roll up to 5% damage, but then the pistol and the sniper rifle, they have damage rolls up to 12%, which both really stood out as a surprise to me. This is basically Massive telling us that they want snipers and pistols to be used more often, and they want to give more power to those two weapon archetypes, but they don't want to do it for free. You know, you have a lot of people running around with a sniper as their secondary and a pistol as their sidearm, so instead of buffing the base damage on all these weapons archetypes a bit, they instead decided to buff these damage rolls on the gloves, so that for the dedicated snipers and pistol users, these weapons will be much stronger than before, but anybody running with those weapons as a backup plan, they won't get those same benefits. And I gotta say, the benefits for these two, they're pretty significant. Just take a look at this. If I take out my M700 with 10,000 firearms in patch 1.7, with the sniper rifle damage on the gloves, I'll be sitting on a per bullet damage of 157,710. But if we do that exact same thing in patch 1.8 with the 12% sniper rifle damage, that same weapon is suddenly going to hit for 171,393. Bam! If that's not a buff to sniper rifles, then I don't know what is. As for the SMGs, again, I'm not sure what's going on with the 5% damage increase instead of the 6%. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that SMGs come with a lot of crit, and crit is really strong right now in PvP, so maybe they wanted to adjust that a bit this way. Maybe not. Obviously, I'm not the guy who did the numbers on these things, so it's quite hard to tell the exact reasoning behind this. But yeah, long story short, the percentage-based damage on the gloves, it changes up a whole lot of things. The big winners are, as expected, the low rate of fire weapons, the sniper rifles, the pistols, and those kind of things, and the losers are the low or the average firearms builds that utilized high RPM weapons and buff stacking to get the majority of their damage. But anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. As always, I hope this video helped you out, and if it did, then I will see you guys later. Or, like they say in the Netherlands, zie je later.